So if anybody listened to John Kerry's testimony in his approval for becoming the new Secretary of State, you'll very much know that Iran is on the mind of the United States and U.S. imperialism, because he said that the U.S. policy toward Iran was not one of containment, but of prevention of Iran acquiring nuclear weaponry. At least that's the cover story for U.S. policy toward Iran. Using that as a justification, the U.S., ever since the revolution in 1979, has had sanctions on Iran and has massively escalated them in the 2000s to cripple the economy of Iran. It's engaged in cyber warfare, cyber terrorism against the Iranian nuclear program. It's aided and abetted Israeli terrorists killing Iranian scientists over the last decade. This is all designed to bring Iran to the negotiating table, to get it to give up its so-called nuclear weapons program, which they actually don't even have. But that's the justification for their policy. And there's many myths about why the U.S. is doing this, which are actually wrong. Now, the claim is that they're trying to prevent a nuclear weapon from Iran developing a nuclear weapon, but that's actually contrary to U.S. intelligence itself. You know, the U.S. intelligence services said that Iran doesn't have weapons capacity, and it doesn't have it in the foreseeable future. It's contrary to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it's contrary even to the Israeli intelligence services. Reuters put it this way: the United States, European allies, and even Israel generally agree on three things about Iran's nuclear program. Tehran does not have a bomb, has not decided to build one, and is probably years away from having a deliverable nuclear warhead. So it's clearly not about nuclear weapons. That's not the issue when you get down to it. And it's completely hypocritical for the U.S. to even be complaining about this, because the U.S. has the largest nuclear weapons stockpile in the history. It's the only country that's used nuclear weapons, blowing Hiroshima and Nagasaki to smithereens and threatening to use nuclear weapons throughout the course of the Cold War. And its best buddy in the Middle East has a nuclear monopoly. It's the only nuclear power, and that is supposedly illegal in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it's a completely hypocritical and wrong-headed claim that this is really about nuclear weapon. There's another set of myths that the U.S. circulates about Iran to justify its belligerence. Number one, that this is an Islamic fundamentalist regime that the U.S. has to go after. Well, that's a problem because its big ally is Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most reactionary regimes on the planet. The second thing they say was, we're standing up against anti-Semitism. We're trying to protect Jews. Well, you got a problem with Saudi Arabia then, which is not exactly, a very pro-Jewish state. The other thing they say is they're for democracy against dictatorship. The U.S. is for democracy promotion. But then look at the best allies that the U.S. has in the Middle East, beginning with Saudi Arabia itself, then looking at Bahrain, then looking at Qatar, then looking at the history of dictatorships that the U.S. has supported in the Middle East. This is all bunk. There is no justification for any of these kind of claims whatsoever. So if these are not the real reasons, what are? What are the drives that the U.S. has to confront Iran? In reality, the U.S. sees Iran as an enemy because it doesn't control it. That's the real thing that is driving U.S. military and economic and political policy towards Iran. It calls anything it doesn't control a rogue state. That's the problem. It's outside of U.S. control. As such, it's a threat to U.S. control of the Middle East and its strategic energy resources. That's the fundamental reason for U.S. policy towards Iran. Now, it's plain to see this if you look at the history of U.S. imperial policy in the Middle East. From World War II on, the U.S. replaced Britain and France as the main dominant power in the region. And they admitted very bluntly the reasons for their interest in the Middle East. It's not like, why is the U.S. in the Middle East? Just ask yourself that question. And it's not an accident. From World War II on, the U.S. was like, these are the strategic energy reserves of the world. So the U.S. has to control it, not for its own consumption, but to control who gets that oil. Because if you control the oil, you control all the powers of the entire planet. So it's a means of dominating the world. You dominate the Middle East, you dominate the world, the spigot of energy for the world system. The State Department in 1945 admitted this bluntly. They said, the oil reserves of the Middle East are a stupendous source of strategic power and it's one of the greatest material prizes in the history of the world. So that's the real reason that drives U.S. Policy. And it's important to understand this because there are a lot of misunderstandings about U.S. Oil policy. It's not about domestic consumption from 1945 to today. And if you look at what Obama's boasting about the U.S. becoming a net oil and natural gas exporter. So this is not about domestic consumption, it's about imperial dominance over these energy reserves. From the Cold War period, which they wanted to control the Middle East so that Russia couldn't get access to those energy reserves. And then after the Cold War, the U.S. wants to continue to dominate them because China, Europe, Japan, all potential rival powers of the U.S. are dependent on the Middle Eastern energy reserves. So that, for those reasons, the U.S. has asserted control over the region from 1945 to today. And they've mainly done it by backing a network of pliant dictatorships, allied regimes, and monarchies as various allies. And those regimes and dictatorships and monarchies have repressed the people of the countries of the Middle East. Its workers, its peasantry, even its middle classes have been horribly repressed by these regimes. The U.S. has been an opponent of any attempt to change that. That is, the U.S. has been the main enemy of democracy, the main enemy of peace, the main enemy of justice and equality in the Middle East. So any Arab nationalists who started to rise up, the U.S. saw them as the enemy. Any democratic movement, the U.S. saw it as an enemy. Any movement for socialism, the U.S. saw it as an enemy. So it's unsurprising that the U.S. has backed a bulk of the coups that have happened in the Middle East from 1945 to today. And really, this has been absolutely continuous from World War II up until the Obama administration. Now, Iran is a pivotal part of this entire history. To understand U.S. policy towards Iran today, you have to understand Iran's role in U.S. Middle East policy from World War II to today. The U.S. saw Arab and Iranian nationalism as a principal enemy for its control over the oil reserves in the Middle East. Anything that would take it out of the private international oil companies' hands, the U.S. saw as a potential threat for its ability to control those energy reserves. So whenever you had an Arab nationalist or an Iranian nationalist regime come to power, either through coups or through democratic elections, the U.S. saw that as an enemy to itself. And Iran in particular was seen as a pivot because it's the second largest oil producer in the world. And the U.S. saw any attempt by democratically elected people in Iran to control those energy reserves, to nationalize those energy reserves as a threat to its dominance. So in 1953, when you had Mohammad Mossadegh get elected democratically to become the president of the country, the CIA, under the desperate plea from today's British Petroleum Company, it was called something different back then, but BP today, called for a U.S.-sponsored CIA coup to topple the regime, the elected government of Mossadegh, which they did. And the CIA then installed the barbaric dictatorship of the Shah of Iran and his horrible security services called the Savak, which essentially built a police state that ruled over the society with the utmost brutality, wiping out the nationalists, killing them, killing the left on the way. And so Iran became a pivot as a country through the Shah of Iran for the domination of the region of the Middle East. The Shah became a henchman regionally for the United States. The second pillar of U.S. dominance in the Middle East has been Saudi Arabia, from 44, when Roosevelt met with the head of Saudi Arabia, up until today to control the Saudi Arabian energy reserves. And the third pillar of U.S. domination has been Israel since its founding in the middle part of the 20th century. And that has been a pivot for U.S. domination of the region. Those three things, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And Israel, as we know, was based on the dispossession of Palestinian people of their land, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine to build the colonial settler state of Israel. Now, why did the U.S. support Israel so importantly as part of these three pillars? Because unlike all the Arab, and in the case of Iran, the Iranian government, they were all subject to the nationalist movements, the socialist movements, the mass movements of their own people, and so they would be unreliable. They could get toppled. Whereas Israel, because it's a fundamentally racist state, it has contempt for the Arab and Palestinian people, has no accountability to the Arab and Palestinian people. So it can be a loyal hitman. It has no accountability, democratic accountability to the people of the region as a colonial settler state. And that's essentially the role that Israel has played as the most loyal pillar of the U.S. imperial policy in the region. So these three pillars were the mechanisms for U.S. domination of the Middle East up until 1979. Which then had a pivotal moment in the history of the Middle East that sets the backdrop for the policy of the United States towards Iran today, and that is the Iranian Revolution. When the people of Iran in 1979 don't see that film that what Ben Affleck made, you'll only get disinformation. One of the most reactionary movies ever made. I can't believe he who made Good Will Hunting was involved in this Islamophobic horror story. So don't waste your time going to see. That's Argo, right? I could barely remember it. Such a horrific movie. Don't see that movie to understand the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This was a genuine mass popular uprising, the democratic expression of middle-class people, working-class people, the peasantry against the hated regime of the Shah of Iran that was anti-imperialist in nature and that was on the verge of actual socialist revolution. When the oil workers went on strike, there was a real threat of a potential socialist revolution in Iran. And the Ayatollah Khomeini actually conducted a counter-revolution to roll back the tremendous breakthrough that workers and peasants and the mass popular movement were threatening. So he hijacked the revolution and contained it in the Islamic state that Khomeini and his followers were built over the last few decades. Nevertheless, even with Khomeini in charge, it was outside the orbit of the United States. So one of the pillars of U.S. domination in the Middle East came tumbling down. So the U.S. was left only with two pillars: Saudi Arabia, which has not got a very good military, and then Israel, which has got one of the biggest militaries in the world, the fourth largest military on the planet. But that wasn't good enough to dominate the region. So they were very concerned about Iran as now a threat to U.S. control of the region instead of being a key pillar for its domination. So at the very same time this happens, the U.S. is supporting Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan. This is an important part of the story because it comes back at the end. The U.S. is supporting Islamic fundamentalists in the war in Afghanistan to get Russia to invade and occupy the country. So these two things happened both in 1979. The toppling of the Shah of Iran and a Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Then President Jimmy Carter, the great human rights president, uses this as an alibi to say, we are going to directly intervene in the Middle East. We will no longer just work through surrogates, because any threat to our oil is a threat to the prosperity of the United States. It's called the Carter Doctrine. So the United States from then on goes on to oppress in the Middle East. And one of the first things they do, start sanctioning Iran for breaking out of U.S. control. Then the U.S. supports Iraq to invade Iran, to precipitate the Iran-Iraq War, which killed over 1 million people over the course of the 1980s. And then Iraq, which negotiates a settlement and is devastated by the war, invades Kuwait right after the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And the Bush elder administration, Papa Bush, takes this as an alibi to go to war against Saddam Hussein. But they don't dislodge him from power. So you've got two rogue regimes, one a former ally of the United States, Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and Iran, which are now both outside of U.S. dominance. So the U.S. implements a policy of what they call dual containment. We're going to sanction both these countries. So the U.S. kills 500,000 kids with sanctions on Iran and continues to cripple the economy of Iran with their own sanctions. And then they turn to other Arab regimes as other pillars. So they bring Egypt into their camp, and they look for other surrogates like in particular Egypt, with the reactionary dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. They get the PLO to capitulate and become a cop for Israel instead of continuing the liberation struggle. But the problem is, over the course of the 1990s, is the dual containment of Iraq and Iran are falling apart. Iran is making oil deals, energy deals with people all over the world. Iraq is making oil and energy deals with people all over the world. That is, their dual containment policy is coming apart at the seams. And so then Bill Clinton becomes the architect that sets us on the path to the confrontation that would produce the Iraq War and then the attack, this kind of belligerence towards Iran that has dramatically escalated. He tightens the sanctions, kills all these children. He conducts all sorts of airstrikes and increases bases throughout the Middle East, which then become antagonists to the Islamic fundamentalists they supported in Afghanistan. So those people then see, okay, we fought the great Satan in the form of Russia and its occupation of Afghanistan. Now we're going to fight the great Satan in terms of the United States in the Middle East. So you now have a whole region that's coming apart at the seams in the Middle East, and its dual containment policy is failing. At the same time that this crisis in U.S. Middle East policy is developing, the world energy system is going into a crisis that we now call peak oil. That is, the big reserves of energy in the world system, they're no longer able to extract more out of them. So they've reached their peak of capacity and are only going to decline in the future. So U.S. energy policy under Clinton, and then especially under Bush Jr., the son of Bush, to put it politely, becomes a policy of maximum extraction. We have to extract as much oil out of the Middle East as possible, and we have to turn to extreme extraction throughout the world. So these two things converge. Three things converge. The former terrorists that the U.S. supported, the terrorists that the U.S. supported in Afghanistan, now turn their eyes to the United States. The U.S. dual containment policy is falling apart, and the U.S. needs maximum extraction of the energy reserves, which then produces the 9/11 attack, and Bush using that as an alibi to go full frontal in the Middle East to overcome the problem of dual containment. And what does Bush say? We've got to topple the government of Iraq and set up a quisling regime, a puppet regime that's going to be friendly to the United States. Then we got to go on to Iran, then we go on to Syria. Think about those names of those countries and what we're seeing now. So Bush sets this logic in motion because they want to remake the Middle East under its own image. They want to take advantage of the U.S. imperial dominance to control the whole region. Now, the problem is that Bush, as we know, if people like you are too young to even remember George Bush, but you probably did, he probably haunted your childhoods. You know, Bush had what I call the reverse Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to lead, not gold. So he proceeded to basically lose two wars. First in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, and a third war he lost through his surrogate in Lebanon when the Hezbollah defeated Israel's invasion of Lebanon. So a disaster. So Bush tried to remake the Middle East, and it blew up in his face. And the unintended consequence of this is that Iran became a relatively stronger power in the Middle East. That's extremely important to understand. So they went from being contained to breaking out of containment to then be strengthened by the U.S. defeat in Iraq. How? How did that happen? One, the enemy regime of the Taliban in Afghanistan, which was an opponent of Iran, of the regime in Iran, was taken down, so that Iran's very happy about that. And then Saddam Hussein, an enemy of Iran, was taken down. And what government replaces Saddam Hussein is a Shia government allied to Iran, directly in concert with the Iranian government. And at the same time, Iran is making deals with China, Russia, Venezuela. Chavez is hanging out with Ahmadinejad. The whole thing is coming apart at the seams for U.S. Imperialism. And that then sets the stage to what we're living through now. So Bush and Obama retreat from the idea of rolling regime change, but they're clearly not going to give up their dominance in the Middle East. This is, whoever dominates the Middle East controls the planet. So it's not like Bush and Obama are going to grow up and stop, blowing up the Middle East. They're going to know they still want to do business in the Middle East. So what has U.S. policy been under Obama, and what is it doing vis-a-vis Iran today? So I'll end up on this. Today, Obama is cultivating their traditional allies. They're attempting to build a network of Sunni states to isolate what they call the Shia crescent: Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. They're trying to isolate that crescent of potential Shia power, as they call it. Effectively, they're trying to generalize the civil war they started in Iraq to the entire region, to pit Sunni against Shia through the entire region, to rely on that traditional religious division in the region. They want to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear warhead. That's their alibi for their whole policy. They want to compel it to go to the negotiating table, but they're prepared to take military action if they can't force Iran to the negotiating table. In particular, Israel, who's like the mad dog, of the Middle East. The Israel who's a surrogate of the United States, but it has its own independent policy, and it wants to maintain its nuclear monopoly within the Middle East. So there's a real danger that Israel will go bananas and do a strike. We already saw what they did in Syria. They bombed in Syria to stop weapons transfers from the Assad regime to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But burnt by their failure in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. will conduct a war, because they don't want to be drawn into an occupation of a very advanced country with a big population and a quite significant military power. But unpredictable things can happen given the belligerence of the United States. And the big problem that the U.S. has confronted under the Obama administration is that the people of the Middle East were like, we don't like this setup. So the first thing begins in the precursor to the Arab Spring is the Iranian Green Movement, when the people of Iran rise up against the Ahmadinejad regime for democracy, against Ahmadinejad's neoliberal policies in the region, against the oppression of women. And the U.S. kind of smiled about that, but I think they were smiling too much, because the virus of revolutionary upheaval has now spread to the entire Middle East. They bring down an allied dictator in the uprising in Tunisia, take down Ben Ali. Then the revolution spreads to Egypt. They take down Mubarak, who was one of the pillars that replaced the pillars they lost. So the whole thing now of U.S. domination of the Middle East is threatened by a growing revolutionary movement throughout the region. This is a real threat to the U.S. strategy in the Middle East. And Obama has essentially tried to hijack the process. They've tried to hijack in every way possible. And the most important example of the hijack has been in Libya, where they basically said to the people revolting against the disgusting regime of Muammar Gaddafi, we will give you money, weapons, we'll send advisors, we'll bomb you from the air to try and contain a real democratic revolution and make sure its outcome is on U.S. imperial terms. They're trying to do a similar thing in Syria. If you're following the incredible revolutionary struggle of the people of Syria against the hated Assad dictatorship, they're trying through the countries of Qatar and Saudi Arabia in particular to influence the course of that revolution so that it goes in a direction that's sympathetic with U.S. power. And then in the case where there have already been democratic changes through the revolutionary upheaval, in the case of Tunisia and in Egypt, they're trying to use the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and aid to co-opt the revolution and neutralize it. So in the case of Egypt, they got Morsi to agree, the new president of Egypt, they got Morsi to agree to a massive neoliberal structural adjustment program in Egypt. Millions upon millions, billions of dollars of aid at the price of cutting wages, benefits, continuing privatization, everything that people revolted against, Morsi's now agreed to. So you can see how they're trying to co-opt the Arab Spring in this fashion. This is, in other words, the U.S. is trying to hijack this thing, but it's out of its control, and you've got all sorts of dynamics that are in motion, and it's trying to neutralize them through this co-optation thing, and then try and get the Sunni states that are still in its camp to target Iran. And the U.S. has been pretty successful. Europe has now imposed sanctions that are very vicious on Iran. They've moved Russia and China significantly into their camp, as well as various other states around the world. And the sanctions, I'm sure Katerina will talk about it, have had a devastating impact on the political economy and lives of people in Iran. So this is the scenario, this is the situation we find ourselves in. So I think what we've got to say in conclusion is the U.S., as I said, is the #1 enemy of peace, justice, and equality and democracy in the Middle East. We should oppose all sanctions on Iran. We should get them dropped now. They're doing nothing good. They never have anywhere on the planet. We should get the U.S. out of the Middle East, and we should stand in mass solidarity. We should stand in solidarity with the mass movements, with the Iranian Green Movement, with the mass uprisings that are continuing to go on in the Middle East, from Iran to Syria to Egypt to everywhere else. Because their struggle, the people of the Middle East, their struggle from below is really our struggle against economic crisis, against the evacuation of democracy. Think about the surveillance, even in the United States, where we supposedly have democracy, and a struggle against the kind of waste of resources that go to wars, which Obama is ratcheting up in a continuing fashion. So we should stand with the people of the Middle East against U.S. imperialism and for their own struggle for self-determination and emancipation.